Frost chewed at the edges of Warren's flannel collar, biting the raw skin at the back of his neck. He stood at the edge of the gravel drive, breathing in the sharp metallic tang of cold diesel exhaust and frozen mud. Around him, a dozen other men in faded Carhartt jackets and stained denim shifted their weight from one bruised heel to the other. They didn't speak much. They just stared at the house, the sagging barn, and the rusted-out husks of farm equipment scattered across the front pasture. They were here to pick the bones. Grady had been dead for 3 weeks. A widowmaker heart attack right there in the middle of his own soybean field, falling face first into the dirt he'd spent 45 years trying to beat a living out of. Now his wife Sarah was sitting somewhere behind the drawn curtains of the farmhouse, listening to the high nasal squeal of the auctioneer's PA system as it echoed off the aluminum siding of the tool shed. Warren scraped the side of his right boot against the frozen edge of a tractor tire to knock loose a clod of ice. His joints ached. A deep, persistent throb in his knuckles and lower spine that told him he was only one bad harvest away from being the man in the ground, and these exact same men would be standing in his driveway waiting to buy his life's work for pennies on the dollar. That was the truth of it. There was no romance in this life. You bled into the dirt, and when you finally stopped moving, your neighbors showed up with empty flatbed trailers and checkbooks. He walked past a line of folding tables set up in the dead grass. They were covered in the detritus of Grady's existence. Chipped ceramic mugs, half-empty boxes of roofing nails, dull handsaws, and bundles of extension cords patched with black electrical tape. The smells hit Warren in layers, the sharp, acrid scent of old mouse droppings, the sweet, heavy odor of stale gear oil, the distinct dusty musk of canvas tarps that had been folded away wet and left to rot. Warren didn't care about the household junk. He walked straight toward the back of the property where the massive leaning structure of Grady's machine shop stood. The double doors were chained back, revealing a cavernous interior swallowed by shadows. The air inside felt 10 degrees colder than the wind-whipped pasture. He stepped over the threshold, his boots crunching on a floor thick with decades of metal shavings and sweeping compound. Dawson the auctioneer was setting up his portable podium near the front of the shop. Dawson was a man who wore too much cheap cologne to cover the smell of his own sweat, a fast-talking liquidator from 3 counties over who didn't know a wrench from a rat-tail file. He treated farm foreclosures and estate sales with the same breathless, practiced indifference. Move the inventory, get the commission, move on. Warren ignored the loud chatter of Dawson testing his microphone. He moved deeper into the gloom toward the back wall. Grady had been a terrible farmer, but he was a brilliant mechanic, a savant wrapped in a greasy coverall. While his crops withered or rotted, Grady was in this shop, hand-stained black breathing life into engines that the dealerships had pronounced dead. Warren had spent countless nights in this exact spot drinking lukewarm black coffee out of a styrofoam cup, watching Grady machine custom bearings on a lathe that looked like it belonged in a museum. Warren stopped in front of the main workbench. It was a massive slab of oak bolted to a frame of welded iron channel. It was currently piled high with what looked to the untrained eye like absolute garbage. Coils of brittle copper tubing, cracked distributor caps, a rusted-out coffee can full of sheer pins swimming in filthy kerosene. But Warren didn't look at the trash. His eyes locked onto a shape huddled in the far corner of the bench, pushed back against the pegboard, partially draped in a stiff, oil-soaked canvas sack. He stepped closer. The smell of raw diesel and burnt ozone was stronger here. He reached out his thick, calloused fingers, brushing the stiff canvas. He didn't lift it. He didn't need to. He could see the bottom edge of the heavy steel baseplate and the distinct hand-milled aluminum housing peeking out from beneath the frayed hem of the fabric. His breath caught in his throat, a hard, dry hitch. It was still here, Grady's masterpiece. Nobody knew about it except Warren. Grady had built it over 3 brutal winters, scavenging parts from aerospace scrapyards down in Wichita and machining the rest by hand. It was a mechanical diesel injection pump calibration stand, but not just any stand. Grady had modified the governor and the flow meters using medical-grade glass syringes and a custom-wound variable frequency drive he'd built from scratch. It could tune the fuel delivery on a heavy-duty diesel block with a precision that outmatched the $60,000 computerized diagnostic machines sitting in the gleaming bays of the John Deere dealership in town. With that machine, a mechanic could squeeze 20% more horsepower and significantly better fuel economy out of any rig in the county. It was the holy grail of independent repair. Without it, you were just guessing. With it, you held the monopoly on keeping the entire region's agricultural fleet running. Warren's heart hammered a heavy, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He looked around. 3 other men had wandered into the shop. Boyd, a loudmouth dairy farmer with more inherited land than sense, was kicking the tires of a rusted arc welder. 2 others were picking through a bin of logging chains. None of them were looking at the bench. None of them knew. Warren pulled his hand back from the canvas, forcing his face to remain a mask of bored indifference. He shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets to hide the sudden tremor in his fingers. "All right, boys, gather round. Let's get this moving before we all freeze to the dirt." Dawson's voice crackled through the cheap speakers, bouncing harshly off the corrugated tin roof. The small crowd shuffled in from the pasture boots dragging. Men spat brown streams of tobacco juice into the dirt and crossed their arms over their chests. Warren took a position near a stack of dry, rotted tractor tires about 10 feet from the workbench. He needed to be close enough to bid, but far enough away that he didn't look overly interested. His stomach churned. A bitter cocktail of acid and black coffee roiled in his gut. He looked toward the house. Sarah was a good woman. She was drowning in debt. Grady had mortgaged everything to keep the farm afloat, and the bank was going to take the land by the end of the month. The money from this auction was supposed to be her parachute. If Dawson knew what was under that canvas, he'd separate it. He'd put a reserve on it. He'd call the commercial shops in the city and start the bidding at $5,000. But Dawson didn't know. Dawson was a suit-playing cowboy holding a clipboard and looking at his watch. "Okay, lot 42, Dawson barked, pointing a manicured finger toward the back wall. "We're not going to spend all day sorting through nuts and bolts. I'm selling the whole workbench, the bench the vice bolted to it, and everything sitting on top of it. What you see is what you get. Scrap metal spare parts and a whole lot of elbow grease." Warren felt a cold sweat break out along his hairline. The sheer stupidity of it was staggering. Dawson was lumping a piece of bespoke precision-engineered machinery in with a pile of rusty washers and an oak table just to save 10 minutes on the schedule. "It's a heavy-duty table, boys." Dawson continued his cadence, picking up into that rhythmic auctioneer chant. "Good iron. Who will give me 500 for the bench and the scrap?" Silence. The men just stared. A cold wind blew through the open doors, rattling the loose tin on the roof. Warren swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. He could speak up. He could raise his hand, stop the auction, and tell Sarah what Grady had actually built. It was the right thing to do, the moral thing. But morality didn't pay the bank. Morality didn't fix the blown transmission on Warren's combine sitting dead in his own barn. If he didn't get his harvest out of the ground before the heavy snows hit, he would be the one holding an auction next November. His own wife would be the one sitting behind drawn curtains. He looked at the oil-stained canvas. It looked like a pile of trash. It looked like exactly what Dawson said it was scrap. "All right, nobody wants to start at 5. Dawson droned, clearly annoyed. "Give me $200 for the whole lot. Just the bench alone is worth that in lumber. 200, looking for $200. It was an insult. It was a desecration of Grady's life. The man had bled over that lathe, ruining his eyesight, inhaling metal dust, building something perfect in a world that was falling apart. And this idiot in a cheap suit was pricing it like a yard sale leftover. Warren felt a sudden hot flash of anger. Not just at Dawson, but at the whole miserable system. At the banks, at the weather, at the rust that ate everything they built. 200. Dawson repeated his voice, dropping a register, threatening to move on. Going once, going... Warren didn't raise his hand. He just gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod of his chin. 200, I got 200 from Warren down in the front. Dawson yelled, pointing his pen like a pistol. Now who will give me 250, looking for 250? 2.5. Warren kept his eyes locked on Dawson's boots. Don't look at the bench. Don't look at the crowd. Play the part. He was just a tired old farmer buying a sturdy table to crack walnuts on. 250, the voice came from Warren's left. Warren didn't turn his head, but his jaw clamped down so hard his molars ached. It was Boyd. Boyd stood there with his hands on his hips, his expensive, pristine leather boots shining in the dull light. He didn't want the scrap. He didn't even want the bench. He just liked the massive cast-iron vise bolted to the end of it, and he had enough disposable income to buy the whole lot just to unbolt the one thing he wanted. 250 from Boyd. Dawson chanted the rhythm, catching fire now. I got 250 looking for 300. Will you give me 3? Warren felt a bead of sweat trace a slow line down his spine beneath his thermals. His bank account was overdrawn. He had exactly $412 in his checking account, and that was supposed to buy groceries and winter diesel for the house generator. He looked at Boyd. Boyd was smirking, chatting casually with the man next to him, not even paying attention to the auction anymore. It was a game to him, pocket change. Warren hated him in that moment. He hated him with a pure, unadulterated venom. He gave Dawson another sharp nod. 300 Warren's back in at 3, looking for 350. 350 for the bench and the scrap. Boyd paused his conversation. He looked over at Warren. His smirk faded slightly, replaced by a look of mild, arrogant curiosity. He looked at Warren's frayed cuffs, the grease permanently tattooed into the lines of his face, the exhausted slump of his shoulders. Boyd was trying to figure out why a broke dirt farmer was bidding $300 for a dirty table. Warren held his breath. Don't look at the canvas. Don't let him see. Boyd looked from Warren to the workbench. His eyes swept over the rusted coffee cans, the cracked distributor caps, and finally rested on the oil-stained canvas sack in the corner. Warren's heart stopped. The shop suddenly went dead silent in his ears. The wind, the auctioneer's chant, the shuffling boots, it all vanished. There was only Boyd staring at the canvas. Boyd squinted. He took a half-step forward, leaning his heavy frame to get a better angle. Warren's muscles locked tight. If Boyd walked over there and lifted that canvas, it was over. Boyd wasn't a mechanic, but he wasn't an idiot either. He would see the milled aluminum, the glass calibration tubes, the intricate wiring. He would know it wasn't junk. And Boyd had the deep pockets to outbid Warren just out of spite, just to see what it was really worth. Move, Warren told himself. Do something. Distract him. But Warren was frozen. He felt trapped in wet cement. His hands buried in his pockets, clenched into tight arthritic fists. His fingernails dug into his palms. Dawson's voice broke the vacuum. I got 300 with Warren. Boyd you in for 350. It's a heavy bench, Boyd. You could park a truck on it. Boyd stayed silent for a long, agonizing second. He kept staring at the canvas. The silence stretched. Even the other men in the crowd started to look back and forth between Boyd and Warren, sensing the sudden, inexplicable tension over a pile of garbage. Boyd slowly raised his hand, pointing a thick, gloved finger at the bench. What's under the rag? Boyd asked, his voice booming over the PA feedback. Warren's stomach hit the floor. The acid rose in his throat, burning like cheap whiskey. Dawson let out an exasperated sigh, dropping the microphone down to his chest. He looked at Boyd like he was a petulant child holding up a checkout line. It's scrap, Boyd, covered in 50 years of grease. I ain't getting my hands dirty to show you every stripped bolt. You're buying the lot blind. Now are you in for 350 or are you out? Boyd chewed the inside of his cheek. He looked at Warren again. Warren forced a dry, rasping chuckle. It sounded hollow, even to his own ears, but he pushed it out. Let him have it, Dawson, Warren said, his voice gravelly and low. If he wants to pay $350 for a busted wood vise and a pile of mouse nests, he can have it. I just wanted the iron channel for welding. It was a lie, and a desperate one. A pathetic bluff. Boyd scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. He looked at the rusted scrap on the table, then back to his pristine boots. He clearly decided he didn't want to haul 1,000 pounds of greasy oak and junk metal back to his spotless pole barn just to salvage a vise. I'm out, Boyd muttered, turning his back to the bench and pulling a thermos from his coat. Let the old man have his trash. The breath left Warren's lungs in a silent, shuddering rush. He felt suddenly lightheaded. He locked his knees to keep from swaying. Out at 350, Dawson chirped the mic back at his mouth. I have $300 going once. Dawson scanned the crowd. The men were already losing interest, turning their collars up against the wind, looking toward the next lot, a row of rusted harrows. Going twice, Warren stared at the wooden gavel in Dawson's hand. The wood was polished smooth from years of striking cheap folding tables, a blunt instrument that broke apart lives and parceled them out in neat little transactions. Sold. The hammer came down with a sharp crack against the podium. Lot 42 goes to Warren for $300. Tag it, boys. Let's move outside to the implements. The crowd immediately turned a dark mass of shuffling canvas and denim, following Dawson out into the freezing wind. The PA system whined and faded as Dawson carried the speaker away. Within 30 seconds, Warren was entirely alone in the cavernous gloom of Grady's shop. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, listening to the wind tear at the loose tin siding. The reality of what had just happened settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. $300. He had just stolen a king's ransom from a widow for $300. His legs felt numb as he finally stepped forward. The floor crunched beneath his boots, sounding louder now in the empty room. He walked slowly toward the massive oak bench. The smell of the shop was different now. Before it had been a museum. Now it was his. The scent of ozone, cut metal, and old grease wasn't a memory of Grady anymore. It was the smell of his own survival and his own guilt. He reached the bench. He stood over the canvas sack. Up close, he could see the intricate weave of the fabric, stained black with years of oil splashes and thick, gritty dust. Warren pulled his right hand from his pocket. His knuckles were white, trembling uncontrollably. He reached out and pinched the stiff, heavy corner of the canvas. Slowly, reverently, he peeled it back. The dim, grayish light from the open shop doors fell upon the machine. It was beautiful. It didn't look like much to a farmer. It was a chaotic tangle of brass fittings, clear glass calibration burettes, and thick, rubber-sheathed wiring. The base was a thick slab of solid steel bolted heavily to the oak. But to Warren, it was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Grady had milled the aluminum housing by hand. The grooves perfectly spaced the metal, polished to a dull, functional shine. The variable speed motor attached to the drive shaft was pristine, protected by a custom-bent sheet metal housing. The injector ports were capped with bright red rubber stoppers to keep the dust out. Warren ran his thumb over the main brass dial. The metal was cold, biting into his skin. He could feel the precision of the knurling. This machine could read fuel delivery down to the fractional cubic millimeter. It was the difference between a tractor hauling a full load up a muddy grade or stalling out and breaking an axle. He traced the wiring up to the glass tubes. They were perfectly aligned, held in place by custom brackets Grady had likely spent weeks fabricating. Warren leaned his weight against the heavy oak bench, dropping his head. The cold edge of the wood dug into his ribs. He closed his eyes, inhaling the deep, resonant smell of the machine. It smelled like potential. It smelled like salvation. But beneath that, it smelled like betrayal. He opened his eyes and looked down at the floor. A few feet away, a small rusted Folgers coffee can lay on its side, spilling a handful of dull, stripped screws into the dirt. Grady's life, swept into a pile sold to the highest bidder and carted away. Warren reached out and gripped the heavy iron vise bolted to the left side of the bench. It was freezing, the cold seeping instantly through his calluses. He squeezed it until his muscles burned. He had the machine. He had the monopoly. He could tune the county's diesel fleet and charge whatever he wanted. He could pay the bank. He could buy the new tires for his combine. He wouldn't be the man in the ground next year. But as he stood there in the silent, freezing shop, looking at the masterpiece he had stolen, Warren Cobb felt poorer than he had ever been in his entire life. Warren backed his battered Dodge flatbed up to the shop doors, the exhaust pipe spitting a thin cloud of blue smoke that hovered in the freezing air. The truck's suspension groaned, the leaf springs protesting as the rear duals chewed through the layer of frost and crushed gravel. He threw the column shifter into park and killed the ignition. The sudden silence left a ringing in his ears, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine block. Getting the bench into the truck was going to break him. He knew that before he even pulled the heavy logging chains from the toolbox behind the cab. It was 1,000 pounds of solid oak cast iron and pure concentrated guilt. He didn't have a forklift. He didn't have a crew of young farmhands with strong backs. He had a pair of rusted come-alongs, 2 heavy-duty ratchet straps, and a spine that had been compressed by 40 years of bouncing on rigid tractor seats. He unspooled the winch cable from the headache rack of the flatbed, dragging the heavy steel hook across the metal grating. It scraped with a harsh, grating shriek. He dragged it into the gloom of the shop, his breath pluming in front of his face. He wrapped a thick yellow toe strap around the base of the bench, threading it carefully through the welded iron channel so it wouldn't crush the delicate calibration stand sitting on top. He hooked the winch cable to the strap. Warren paused, leaning his forehead against the freezing oak edge of the workbench. His lungs burned. He could smell the stale metallic tang of his own sweat mixing with the deep petroleum musk of the shop. He closed his eyes, mapping out the physics of the pull. If the bench snagged on a crack in the concrete, the winch would tear the legs clean off. If the angle was wrong when it hit the ramp of the flatbed, it would flip, smashing Grady's masterpiece into a pile of shattered glass and twisted aluminum. He walked back to the truck and grabbed the wired winch remote. He pressed the button. The electric motor whined high and strained. The cable snapped taut, vibrating like a plucked bass string. Inside the shop, the bench shrieked. The heavy steel legs dragged across the concrete floor, leaving deep white gouges in the decades of accumulated grease. It moved an inch, then another. Warren watched the calibration machine. The canvas sack shivered, but the machine held firm, bolted tightly to the oak. He kept his thumb clamped down on the button, the winch motor dropping an octave as it took the full weight of the load. It took 45 agonizing minutes. He had to stop twice to wedge a pry bar under the rear legs, lifting the iron just enough to clear the lip of the truck bed. By the time the bench was finally centered on the flatbed, Warren's thermal shirt was soaked through with cold sweat. His hands shook so violently he could barely operate the heavy steel binders to chain the load down. He clamped the lever down the heavy ratcheting sound, echoing off the empty shop walls, locking his theft into place. He tossed the pry bar into the bed. It clattered against the iron vise. "You got a heavy haul there, Warren." Warren flinched, his heart slamming against his ribs. He spun around his hand instinctively, dropping to the greasy rag hanging from his back pocket. Sarah stood at the edge of the gravel drive, about 20 feet away. She had a thick knitted shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her gray hair pulled back in a loose, messy knot. Her face was pale, the skin around her eyes swollen and bruised with exhaustion and grief. She looked smaller than Warren remembered, shrunken as if Grady's death had physically hollowed her out. Just some scrap, Sarah," Warren rasped. His throat felt like it was coated in ground glass. "A bench, some iron." Sarah looked past him, staring into the dark, empty maw of her husband's shop. She didn't look at the canvas sack sitting on the flatbed. She just looked at the empty space where the bench used to sit. The pale rectangle of clean concrete on the floor. Grady practically lived at that table. She said, her voice thin, barely carrying over the wind. "I used to bring him supper out here. He'd eat with one hand and wipe grease off a bearing with the other. Said he couldn't leave an engine sitting open or it'd lose its soul." She offered a small, fragile smile. It didn't reach her eyes. Warren swallowed hard. The acid in his stomach surged. He wanted to tell her. The words clawed at the back of his throat. "Sarah, there's a machine under this tarp worth $6,000. I stole it from you. I robbed your husband's ghost." He gripped the edge of the truck bed, his knuckles turning white. "He was a good man, Sarah. The best mechanic in the county. He was," she agreed, softly pulling the shawl tighter. She looked back at Warren, her eyes clear and painfully sincere. "I'm glad you got his bench, Warren. He'd want someone who knows the value of hard work to have it. Not one of these corporate farms. You take care of it." She nodded once, a gesture of quiet, devastating grace, and turned back toward the farmhouse. Warren stood frozen by the rear tire, watching her walk away. The wind whipped her gray skirt around her boots. He felt entirely, profoundly sick. He wasn't a hard worker. He was a vulture. He climbed into the cab of the Dodge, slamming the heavy metal door to shut out the cold. but he couldn't shut out the sight of that pale, empty rectangle on the concrete floor. Snow began to fall halfway down County Road 9. It wasn't the soft, powdery snow of deep winter. It was wet, heavy, and vicious, driving sideways across the barren, harvested fields and slapping against the windshield like wet cement. The Dodge's wiper blades, brittle and torn, smeared the slush back and forth in a wide gray arc that barely offered a window to the asphalt. Warren hunched over the steering wheel, peering through the gap in the smeared glass. The heater core was plugged, blowing only a weak, tepid breath against his knuckles. He kept checking his side mirrors. In the distorted reflection of the glass, he could see the dark, humped shape of the tarp covering the calibration stand, vibrating with every pothole the truck hit. He drove 10 miles below the speed limit. Every time the rear tire slipped on a patch of black ice, his stomach dropped. If he wrecked the truck here, if he rolled it into the deep drainage ditches lining the county road, it would all be for nothing. The silence in the cab was oppressive, amplifying the chaotic noise of the storm outside. To fill it, Warren's mind began to work, frantically weaving a protective web of rationalizations around what he had done. It was survival. That's what he told himself, gripping the cracked leather of the steering wheel until his joints ached. Sarah was going to lose the farm anyway. $3,000 from a fair auction wouldn't have saved her from the bank. It would have just delayed the inevitable by a month. But this machine could save his farm. Warren ran the math in his head, staring at the hypnotic blur of the center line. His combine was dead in the barn, the injectors hopelessly fouled. A new set from the dealership would cost him $1,200 he didn't have plus labor. With Grady's machine, he could clean, rebuild, and recalibrate his own injectors for the cost of a few copper crush washers and a gallon of diesel. He could get the harvest in, and after that, he thought about Boyd. Boyd with his brand new 300 horsepower John Deere tractors and his pristine boots. When one of those green behemoths threw a code and started starving for fuel, Boyd would have to pay a flatbed service to haul it 70 miles to the city. Or Warren could do it right here. He could charge $80 an hour, cash. He'd have the only functioning heavy-duty calibration stand within a 3-hour drive. Grady wanted a mechanic to have it, he repeated to himself, clinging to Sarah's parting words like a lifeline. He didn't build it for the bank. He built it for the dirt. The Dodge hit a deep, frost-heaved rut. The rear suspension slammed down hard. A loud metallic crack echoed from the flatbed. Warren cursed, slamming his foot on the brake. The truck skidded on the wet asphalt, the rear end kicking out slightly before he corrected it, guiding the heavy rig onto the muddy shoulder. He threw it into park and shoved the door open. The wind hit him instantly, biting through his coat and stealing his breath. The snow was accumulating fast, turning the dead grass on the shoulder into a slick, white slurry. He waded through the mud to the back of the truck. One of the heavy ratchet binders had popped open. The sudden jolt had snapped the safety catch, loosening the heavy chain over the bench. The canvas tarp had blown halfway back, exposing the polished aluminum housing of the machine to the driving snow. Warren scrambled onto the flatbed, his boots slipping dangerously on the wet steel grating. He threw his body over the machine, shielding the delicate glass burettes from the freezing moisture. The metal was ice cold against his chest. He grabbed the thick canvas and pulled it back down, tucking it tightly under the base plate. His hands were numb, his fingers clumsy as he grabbed the heavy steel lever of the chain binder. He leaned his entire body weight into it, grunting against the strain, pulling the chain taut until the binder snapped shut with a violent metallic clack. He stayed there on his knees for a moment, the snow piling up on his shoulders. He rested his hand on the top of the canvas, feeling the rigid shape of the machine beneath. It didn't feel like a piece of equipment anymore. It felt like a living, breathing thing. A parasite. He had saved it from the auction block, but now he was tied to it. The secret was a physical weight heavier than the iron it was bolted to. He crawled off the flatbed, his knees soaked through with freezing mud. He didn't look at the machine again as he climbed back into the cab. He shoved the truck into gear and pulled back onto the road, the heater blowing uselessly against his shivering frame. The inside of Warren's barn smelled of wet rot, ancient hay, and the sharp acidic tang of pigeon droppings. It was a massive sway-backed structure that leaked in a dozen places, the dirt floor permanently damp. Sitting dead in the center aisle was his combine, a rusted green Leviathan missing its side panels, its engine block exposed like an open wound. Warren backed the Dodge down the center aisle, the headlights cutting through the dusty gloom. He left the truck running, the exhaust filling the barn with a familiar suffocating haze. He spent the next hour using his old Ford tractor and a set of heavy nylon slings to lift the bench off the flatbed. It was a terrifying, reckless operation. The tractor's hydraulics whined in protest, the front tires lifting an inch off the dirt as the weight of the oak bench transferred to the loader bucket. Warren held his breath, creeping the tractor backward in agonizing inches, waiting for a hose to burst or a chain to snap. Finally, the bench settled onto the packed earth floor near the back wall of the barn, right beneath a string of flickering dust-coated fluorescent tube lights. Warren killed the tractor. The silence of his own barn felt different than the silence in Grady's shop. Grady's shop had felt like a tomb. This felt like a holding cell. He didn't wait to rest. A manic energy had taken hold of him, a desperate need to justify the agonizing guilt sitting heavy in his chest. He needed to see it work. He needed to prove that the sin was worth it. He walked over to the bench and gripped the edges of the stiff canvas tarp. He pulled it away, throwing the heavy fabric into a corner. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light, the machine looked completely alien in the squalor of his barn. The brass fittings caught the weak light. The polished aluminum gleamed. The thick glass tubes were pristine, devoid of a single speck of dust. Warren went to a cluttered shelf and found an old, heavy-gauge extension cord. He spent 10 minutes with a pair of dull wire strippers, cursing as he spliced a heavy 220-volt plug onto the end of the machine's power lead, wrapping the bare copper in thick layers of black electrical tape. He plugged it into the heavy receptacle on the wall. Nothing happened. For a terrifying, breathless moment, Warren thought it was dead. He thought he had bounced it too hard on the road, shattered a hidden glass fuse, or ripped a delicate wire from its soldering point. He dragged his hand down his face, smearing grease across his cheek. Then he saw it. A small, heavy toggle switch tucked beneath the main control panel, guarded by a piece of bent steel. Warren reached out. His finger rested on the cold metal of the switch. He flipped it. A deep, resonant hum instantly filled the barn. It wasn't the rattling, dying noise of the machinery Warren was used to. It was smooth, perfectly balanced. The variable frequency drive spooled up, emitting a high electronic whine that settled into a steady, powerful thrum. A small green LED light flickered to life on the control box. Warren felt a jolt of pure adrenaline spike through his tired blood. He walked over to the dead combine and pulled one of the fouled injectors from the rag he had wrapped it in. He brought it back to the bench. His hands moved with practiced mechanical intuition. He didn't have a manual, but he didn't need one. He mounted the heavy steel injector into the holding bracket, clamping it down tightly. He connected the high-pressure steel fuel line from the machine's delivery port to the top of the injector. He grabbed a jug of fresh winter blend diesel and poured it into the machine's reservoir tank. He turned the main brass dial. The machine's internal pump kicked in. It was a heavy rhythmic thudding sound. Thump, thump, thump. Warren watched the glass calibration burettes. Slowly, perfectly, the clear liquid began to rise in the left-hand tube. The machine was pushing diesel through the fouled injector, forcing it past the carbon buildup at exactly 3,000 pounds per square inch. The machine's digital display, a small LCD screen Grady must have scavenged from industrial surplus, lit up. It read the flow rate, 42.5 cubic millimeters per stroke. Warren stared at the number. The injector was completely out of spec. It was supposed to be pushing 55. That's why the combine was dying under load. He grabbed a specialized wrench from his toolbox, a tool he hadn't used in 5 years because he couldn't test the results. He cracked the locking nut on top of the injector and slightly turned the adjustment screw. He looked at the screen. 50.1. He turned it a fraction of an inch more. 55.0. Perfect. Dead center. Perfect. Warren turned the machine off. The hum died away, leaving only the sound of his own heavy breathing in the cold barn. The smell of fresh atomized diesel hung in the air, sweet and sharp. It worked. It worked better than anything he had ever seen in his life. He could rebuild the other 5 injectors tonight. The combine would run tomorrow. He was saved. He stood there staring at the green numbers slowly fading on the digital screen. The victory was absolute. The machine was his. The power to fix his broken life was literally at his fingertips. He picked up a greasy rag and wiped his hands. He wiped and wiped, rubbing the rough fabric over his calluses until the skin burned. The grease came off, leaving his hands stained their usual permanent dull gray. But as he looked down at his shaking fingers, standing in the cold, damp squalor of his barn, he realized the dirt he felt now wasn't something he could ever wash away. Frost bit deep into the topsoil by the second week of November, turning the ruts in the fields to jagged concrete. Warren sat in the cab of his combine, the heater blasting dust and dry air against his shins. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the deep rhythmic vibration of the massive diesel engine roaring beneath him. It didn't hesitate. It didn't stutter when the header bit into a thick, tangled patch of damp soybeans. The engine just dug in the governor, opening up, feeding perfectly metered high-pressure fuel into the cylinders. The black smoke blowing from the exhaust stack was clean and thin. He harvested for 3 days straight, sleeping in the cab, surviving on stale thermos coffee and cold ham sandwiches. When he finally dumped the last hopper of beans into the grain cart, the first hard snow of the season was already beginning to stick to the windshield. He had beaten the weather. He had beaten the bank. But the victory tasted like copper on his tongue. Word travels through a farming community like fire through dry chaff. Within a week, the men who had stood in the freezing mud at Grady's auction started showing up in Warren's driveway. They brought their sick iron, a sputtering swather, a logging truck that wouldn't pull a grade, a tractor that dumped raw, unburned diesel out the pipe, fouling the air. They didn't ask how Warren was fixing them. They only cared that the dealership in the city had a 4-week backlog and charged $150 an hour just to hook a laptop to the diagnostic port. Warren charged half that in cash, and he had the parts back to them by morning. He became a ghost in his own barn. He dragged a dozen heavy, damp, round bales of hay across the dirt floor, stacking them 3 high, to build a thick, sound-dampening wall around the back corner. It became a hidden room, a sanctuary, an altar to his own quiet treason. When a neighbor dropped off a set of fouled injectors, Warren would wait until their taillights disappeared down the county road. Only then would he slip behind the hay wall. He would peel back the stiff canvas tarp, plug the heavy 220-volt cord into the wall, and flip the toggle switch. The machine would hum that perfect balanced electronic whine, cutting through the smell of old manure and wet dirt. Warren would clamp the injectors into the heavy steel vise. He would watch the amber diesel rise in the glass calibration burettes, turning the brass dial, chasing perfection, down to the fraction of a millimeter. He learned the machine's quirks. He learned how the variable drive responded to different temperatures. He felt closer to Grady in those solitary freezing hours than he ever had when the man was alive. He was learning to speak the language Grady had spoken, a language written in fuel pressures and mechanical tolerances. By the end of the month, Warren had an old metal Folgers can sitting on his kitchen counter. It wasn't filled with rusted screws. It was crammed full of crumpled $20, $50, and $100 bills. It was thick and heavy. He took $3,000 into town and slammed it down on the worn laminate counter at the First National Bank, catching up on his mortgage. The teller, a young woman who had looked at him with quiet pity for 2 years, blinked in surprise as she fed the bills into the counting machine. Warren walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk. The winter sun was blinding, reflecting off the dirty snow piled in the gutters. He breathed the freezing air into his lungs. He was safe. The farm was safe. But as he looked at his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, he couldn't shake the sensation that they were stained. He scrubbed them with industrial pumice every night until the skin was raw and red, but he still felt the grease. It wasn't engine oil anymore. It was the residue of the lie. He was building his survival on the bones of a dead man, hiding behind a wall of hay, like a thief counting stolen silver. Headlights cut across the front window of Warren's farmhouse, violently bright. Warren pushed his plate of cold eggs away and stood up, his joints popping in the quiet kitchen. He walked to the window and pulled back the faded curtain. A massive dual rear-wheel Ford pickup was idling in his driveway. It was immaculate. Deep metallic blue lifted with a heavy steel brush guard that gleamed under the yard light. It wasn't a work truck. It was a tax write-off. Boyd stepped out of the cab, leaving the engine running. He wore a heavy wool coat with a shearling collar, his expensive boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. Warren's stomach seized. A hard, cold knot formed just below his ribs. He grabbed his worn Carhartt jacket from the hook by the door, shrugging it on as he stepped out onto the porch. The wind immediately bit at his cheeks. "Evening, Warren." Boyd called out, leaning against the fender of his truck. He didn't sound arrogant tonight. He sounded frustrated, strained. "Boyd," Warren replied, keeping his voice flat. He stayed on the porch a few feet above the driveway. "What brings you all the way out here past dark?" Boyd spat a stream of sunflower seeds onto the frozen mud. "Heard a rumor you've been doing some moonlighting. Heard you resurrected Calvin's Peterbilt when the dealership told him the block was scrap." "I get lucky sometimes," Warren said slowly. He crossed his arms. "I don't believe in luck," Boyd snapped, his frustration bleeding through. "I believe in results. My big deer, the 9R, the one I used to pull the heavy ripper. It threw a code this afternoon right in the middle of the North Quarter, went into limp mode. Dealership sent a tech out with a laptop. Says the fuel rail pressure is all over the map. Needs a complete set of injectors recalibrated." Warren didn't blink. He knew exactly what that meant. So let them do it. Boyd kicked at a chunk of ice. They want to send them to Omaha. Said they don't have the bench for it here. $4 grand and a 3-week turnaround. Ground's freezing solid, Warren. If I don't get that field ripped by Friday, I'm out $20,000 in spring prep. Boyd looked up, his eyes meeting Warren's. It was the first time Warren had ever seen the man look vulnerable. The sheer, overwhelming scale of modern farming had finally cornered him. All his money, all his pristine equipment, and he was completely paralyzed by 6 pieces of clogged brass and steel. "I'll pay you double whatever Calvin gave you," Boyd said, his voice dropping slightly. A concession. A plea. "Cash. Tonight. Just get me running." Warren looked at the man. He remembered Boyd at the auction. He remembered the smirk, the casual way he had bid up the price of a dead man's life just to strip a vice off a table. Warren had hated him then. He wanted to tell Boyd to get off his land. He wanted to let the man freeze in his own field. But then he thought of the thick wad of bills in the coffee can. He thought of the property taxes due in spring. "Pull them!" Warren grunted. "Bring the injectors here. Don't bring the whole tractor, just the parts." "I have them in the passenger seat," Boyd said, a brief flash of relief crossing his face. He reached into the cab and pulled out a heavy cardboard box, setting it on the hood. "Take them to the barn," Warren said, stepping off the porch. They walked in silence. Warren slid the heavy wooden barn doors open, the rusty tracks screeching in the cold air. He hit the light switch. The weak fluorescent tubes flickered, casting long, harsh shadows across the dirt floor. Boyd stepped inside, looking around. His nose wrinkled slightly at the smell of pigeon rot and stale diesel. "You run a shop out of this, I get by," Warren muttered. He took the box from Boyd. "Wait out by your truck. This takes concentration. I don't need somebody breathing down my neck." Boyd opened his mouth to argue, then shut it. He nodded curtly. "I'll be in the cab. Heater's running." Warren watched Boyd walk away. Once the barn doors were closed, he moved quickly. He slipped behind the wall of hay bales, pulling the cardboard box with him. He peeled back the canvas tarp. He worked fast, his hands moving with desperate precision. Boyd's injectors were massive, complex pieces of modern engineering, but they functioned on the same basic principles of pressure and fluid dynamics. Warren clamped the first one into the stand, powered the machine up, and turned the dial. The machine hummed. The glass burettes filled. The digital screen flashed. Warren lost himself in the numbers. For 45 minutes there was no Boyd, no farm, no bank. There was only the heavy thrum of the pump and the delicate turn of the wrench. He dialed each injector, imperfectly wiping them down with a clean rag until the steel shined. When he finished, he turned the machine off. The silence rushed back in heavy and oppressive. He covered the stand, made sure the tarp was tucked tight, and stepped out from behind the hay. Boyd was standing in the center aisle of the barn. Warren froze. His heart slammed against his sternum so hard it bruised. Boyd wasn't looking at Warren. He was looking at the hay wall. He was looking at the thick black power cord Warren had snaked out from behind the bales to plug into the wall receptacle. "Thought you told me to wait outside?" Warren rasped, his voice sounding thin and weak in his own ears. Boyd turned slowly. His eyes dropped to the box of finished injectors in Warren's hands. Then he looked back at the hay. "Truck was getting stuffy," Boyd said casually, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He took a few steps closer to the hay wall. "Loud hum coming from back there, Warren. Sounds like 3-phase power. Sounds industrial." "Just an old compressor," Warren lied. His palms were sweating. The heavy box in his hands felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Boyd stopped. He looked at the heavy power cord, tracing it with his eyes back to the bales. Then his gaze drifted to the corner of the barn, where a heavy iron vise sat on the dirt, unbolted from the bench Warren had hauled out of Grady's shop. Boyd's eyes narrowed. The gears were turning. The memory of the auction, the desperate bidding over a pile of scrap, the canvas tarp, and now the impossible speed of Warren's mechanical work. "That's a nice vise," Boyd said softly. "Looks exactly like the one I bid on over at Grady's place. The one you bought for $300. Warren didn't speak. He gripped the box tighter. Boyd looked from the vise to the hay wall, and finally to Warren. The smirk returned to his face, but this time it wasn't arrogant. It was the sharp, predatory grin of a man who just found the weak spot in a fence. "You didn't buy a table, did you, Warren?" Boyd chuckled a dry, rasping sound. "That old lunatic Grady built something, and you hid it under a rag and bought it for pennies while his widow watched." The air in the barn felt suddenly suffocating. Warren wanted to hit him. He wanted to drop the box, grab the heavy pry bar leaning against the wall, and wipe that grin off Boyd's face. But he couldn't, because Boyd was right. Every filthy word of it was right. "The parts are done," Warren said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He shoved the box into Boyd's chest. $800, cash. Boyd took the box. He didn't push past the hay wall. He didn't need to see the machine. He already had the leverage. He pulled a thick money clip from his pocket and peeled off 8 $100 bills, dropping them onto the hood of Warren's dead Ford tractor. "Keep the change," Warren Boyd said, turning toward the barn doors. He paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. "I'll be sure to tell the boys where to bring their business. You've got quite the operation going here. Real honest work." Boyd slid the door open and stepped out into the dark. A minute later, the heavy diesel engine of his truck roared, and the headlights swept away, leaving Warren alone in the silence. Warren stared at the 8 crisp bills sitting on the tractor hood. He didn't touch them. He felt a sudden violent urge to vomit. He had paid off the bank, but he had sold his soul to do it, and now Boyd held the receipt. The winter wind stripped the last dead leaves from the oak tree in Sarah's front yard. The house looked dark from the county road, save for a single warm yellow light burning in the kitchen window. Warren parked his Dodge at the end of the driveway. He killed the engine and sat in the cab for a long time, listening to the metal ticking as it cooled. He looked down at the passenger seat. Sitting on the cracked vinyl was a thick, brown manila envelope. It contained $4,000, everything he had made. Every dollar from Calvin, from Boyd, from the neighbors. It was thick and heavy. He grabbed the envelope, shoved open the heavy truck door, and stepped out into the bitter cold. The walk up the gravel drive felt like a march to the gallows. His boots crunched loudly. He walked up the wooden steps of the porch, the boards groaning under his weight. He didn't knock. He pressed the heavy brass doorbell. It chimed deep inside the house. He waited. He could hear footsteps shuffling across linoleum. The porch light snapped on, blinding him for a second. The deadbolt clicked, and the heavy wooden door swung open. Sarah stood there, wrapped in a thick quilted robe. She looked tired, the deep lines around her mouth etched permanently into her skin. She blinked at him, surprised. "Warren," she said, her voice raspy. "It's near 10 o'clock. Is something broken?" "No, Sarah," Warren said softly. He pulled his hat off, crushing the brim between his rough hands. "Nothing's broken. Can I come in?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped back, pulling the door wide. Come in out of the wind. I've got coffee on the stove. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon old paper and the bitter, comforting scent of cheap coffee. It was warm. Too warm. Warren felt sweat prickle at his hairline beneath his heavy coat. He stood awkwardly by the kitchen table, feeling massive and filthy in her clean house. Sarah poured a mug of black coffee and set it on the table. Sit down, Warren. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Warren pulled out a wooden chair and sat. The joints creaked. He looked at the mug. He didn't touch it. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the thick manila envelope, and placed it squarely in the center of the floral tablecloth. Sarah looked at the envelope, then at Warren. What is that? Warren swallowed. His throat felt perfectly dry. It's money, Sarah. $4,000. She frowned, confusion wrinkling her brow. For what did Grady owe you money? He never mentioned. No, Warren interrupted, his voice cracking. He forced himself to look her in the eyes. He forced himself to face the widow. I owe you. I robbed you, Sarah, right in your own driveway. While you were sitting in this house listening to that auctioneer, Sarah went perfectly still. The silence in the kitchen became absolute, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator. She didn't reach for the envelope. Explain it to me, she said, her voice dropping all warmth. Warren told her. He didn't spare himself. He didn't use flowery words or try to soften the blow. He told her about the canvas tarp. He told her about the milled aluminum, the glass burettes, the variable frequency drive. He told her how Grady had built a machine worth thousands, a machine that held the monopoly on heavy diesel repair in the county, and how Warren had let the auctioneer sell it to him for $300 as a pile of rusty scrap. He told her about the combine, about Boyd, about the wall of hay in his barn. When he finished, he sat back, his chest heaving as if he had just run a mile. He waited for the anger. He waited for her to scream, to slap him, to pick up the heavy rotary phone on the wall and call the sheriff. He deserved all of it. Sarah didn't move. She stared at the envelope on the table. Her eyes tracked the thick bulge of the cash. Slowly she reached out. Her fingers, twisted with arthritis, brushed the rough paper. She opened the flap. She looked at the stacks of crumpled bills. She let out a long, shuddering breath. It wasn't a sob. It sounded like exhaustion. He spent 3 winters out there, Sarah murmured, her voice hollow. She wasn't talking to Warren. She was talking to the ghost. Missing dinners, freezing his hands. I told him he was wasting time. I told him he should be fixing the tractor, not building some science project. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, but they were fierce, harder than flint. You stole from me Warren Cobb, she said, her voice steady and quiet. It cut worse than a scream. You saw me drowning and you stepped on my head to pull yourself into the boat. I know, Warren choked out. He looked down at his scarred, stained hands. I know I did. I brought it back. The money. It's yours. It's all of it. I can't keep the machine here. It's bolted down, but I won't use it again. Sarah stared at him. She looked at the broken, tired old man sitting in her kitchen. She looked at the grease permanently tattooed into the lines of his face. She knew that look. It was the same look Grady had worn for 40 years. The look of a man who was fighting a war against dirt and rust, a war he was destined to lose. She picked up the envelope. She pulled out a stack of bills. She counted out $2,000, flattening the crumpled notes against the tablecloth. She slid the remaining half across the table, back toward Warren. Warren stared at the money, confused. Sarah, I heard what you said. Sarah cut him off sharply. "You're a thief, Warren, a coward, but you're also a mechanic, and Grady built that machine to keep these farms breathing." She picked up her half of the money and folded it tightly, gripping it in her fist. "I can't use it." She continued, her tone entirely pragmatic, entirely grounded in the brutal reality of their existence. "If you give it back, it sits in an empty shop and rusts. If I try to sell it, some corporate shop in Omaha buys it, and the men around here go bankrupt paying their prices." She leaned forward, locking her eyes onto his. "You keep the machine, Warren. You run it. You fix Calvin's truck. You fix Boyd's tractor, and you charge that arrogant bastard double. But you don't hide behind a hay wall anymore. You put a sign out by the road." Warren felt his breath catch. He looked at the money pushed toward him. "We are partners now," Sarah stated, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You do the labor, you provide the shop. I own the patent. 50% of every job you do on that bench goes into an envelope, and you bring it to this kitchen table on the 1st of every month. Do you understand me?" It wasn't forgiveness. It was a ledger. It was a contract forged in the bitter cold of survival. She was holding him accountable, binding him to Grady's legacy with chains of iron and cash. Warren looked at the woman. He saw the strength in her spine, the sheer undeniable grit that had kept her husband going for decades. He slowly reached out and put his rough hand over the stack of bills she had pushed toward him. "I understand," Warren said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't clean. It wasn't perfect. But it was honest. "Good," Sarah said, picking up her coffee mug. She took a slow sip. "Now drink your coffee before it gets cold. You have a lot of work to do." Warren wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic mug. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. But inside the kitchen, sitting across from the widow of the man he had wronged, the suffocating weight in Warren's chest finally began to fracture. He was still a tired old man with grease under his nails. He was still fighting the rust. But for the first time since the gavel fell, he knew he wasn't fighting it alone.